Okay, hello everybody. So I'm Carlos Santos, as you probably know, and I'm recording this as part of just the training that we gave in the monastery. And there were there were four different classes, but I'm going to be recording today three different classes that I gave, the most important ones about silence and solitude. And yeah, so I would like to give you a briefer version of what I gave, of what I taught live when I was in the monastery with the students or the trainees from the School of Mission in Germany. And so, yeah, so basically we have the lifestyle of Jesus, of Jesus's rhythms, and how Jesus actually embodies this idea of active ministry and withdrawing into solitude. We're going to see that. And then we're going to see typically the two enemies in solitude. Because typically, when we speak about having a quiet time or being in solitude with God, we often associate very good things to it, or maybe happy or good things that can happen there, but often we do not think of the bad things that can happen in solitude, or like things that we subjectively experience as threatening or as disorienting. And so the idea with this with the last two classes is to get an awareness of the enemies in solitude, right? And I drew inspiration from some of the teachings from Practicing the Way, which is a nonprofit led by John Mark Comer. But I have modified different things because in the end I added certain things that I think is important. So it's not really the same class, but there are few elements from those teachings. And so anyways, so the enemies in solitude are two. The first enemy in solitude is the self, or basically us or you. When you go into solitude, you have to be also with yourself. And then the second enemy in solitude is Satan, which often we do not think of Satan as waiting for us in times of solitude, even though it's in the Gospels. But we're going to then address these three different topics in this order. So anyways, let's start with the lifestyle of Jesus. Now, I'm not going to be using slides because when I prepared these teachings for the monastery, we didn't have iPads, nor phones, nor anything like that. So we were just using paper, and people had to open their Bibles and all of that. So I'm going to ask you to do the same as you follow along. And so yeah, so the idea is basically to go deeper into this. And so yeah, so anyways, let's start with the lifestyle of Jesus, which this was kind of like a introduction for to talk about solitude. Now, many of you know or are aware that in the internet, we find many channels about productivity and many things like that, and how to structure or to schedule or to plan your perfect week, right? Where you maybe schedule time for health, for your side hustle, for your business, or for your studies, and then for family and many other things. And I think this is actually a good thing, right? Being intentional with our times. What is interesting to me is that often we can focus on Jesus's actions, sometimes Jesus's fruit, or miracles, or strategies, or things that he did or say. But many times, little attention is given to Jesus's rhythm in his life and in his ministry, right? And many times, this is due to the fact that we sometimes focus on Jesus's content, meaning the content of his teachings, but we skip or we do not really ponder or reflect on these few verses in between. And today we're going to basically do that, reflect on the few verses in between. Okay. Now we're going to start we're going to look at very few scriptures. We're going to look at 3 scriptures, very short passages from the Gospels, just to really see this reading. I could give you more, but this will suffice. Okay, so I want to imprint on your heart a conviction from just looking at few scriptures on Jesus's rhythm, the way he lived his life, and you will see what I mean by this idea of active ministry and withdrawing into solitude. Now we're going to start with the passage in Luke chapter 5, verses 15 through 16. Luke chapter 5, verses 15 through 16. And I'm using the New International Version. It says the following. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Now, pay attention to this part. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. So here, Jesus' popularity is growing rapidly, right? Crowds are constantly coming for healing and teaching, but instead of staying endlessly available, what Jesus does is very interesting here. He intentionally withdraws into solitude and prayer. Now, what is interesting about the phrase lonely places in Greek is the word eremos, E-R-E-M-O-S, E-R-E-M-O-S, eremos. Eremos could be translated into many phrases like the lonely place, the desert, the wilderness, the quiet place. The point here is that it was a place where there wasn't too much noise. It could be a place in nature or desert, of course, because of the geography where Jesus was. Typically, it was the wilderness, it was the desert. So imagine, it was very quiet compared to our parks and things like that. But the point here is that Jesus often, so it was not an exception, it was a habit, it was a routine, it was part of his schedule, so to speak. Often withdrew to lonely places and pray. Okay, and it's very interesting the context, because again, crowds were constantly coming for healing and teaching, right? So people wanted Jesus' time and availability because of what he could teach and do for people. And Jesus didn't double down on the opportunity necessarily. He actually withdrew intentionally into solitude and prayer, and he did that often. Okay, this is very important. We can look at the next scripture in Mark chapter 1 verse 35. The Gospel of Mark chapter 1 verse 35. And it says the following. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place, the eremos, where he prayed. Now, this is important because the context of this is that Jesus is 40 days in solitude in the eremos. Then a short, intense period of active ministry, teaching, healing, and ministering to crowds in Capernaum. And before continuing the work, Jesus goes back into solitude. You see? So you see the pattern here. We see that all the time. There is active ministry and then withdrawing into solitude. And this is key. This is essential. And it's part of Jesus' lifestyle to sustain what he was trying to do for humanity. And just a last passage, again, we could mention more. I encourage you to read the gospel, just paying attention to Jesus' lifestyle, what happens in between active ministry, or in between teachings, or in between some events, and pay attention to those verses that often we overlook or skip, or not skip but not pay attention to. And lastly, for example, John chapter 6 verse 15. John chapter 6 verse 15. It says the following: Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. This is pretty intense. So basically, right after feeding the 5,000, the crowds wanted to make Jesus king by force. And instead of embracing popularity and power, he withdraws again into solitude. Now, what is surprising to me is that, oh man, if a lot of people is coming to me, let's double down on that. Let's create, like, I don't know, more marketing. Let's create a course. Let's appear in more places. I mean, you want to make me king? Of course I want to be king. What are you talking about? Of course we want that. And it's very interesting because I don't remember in which questionnaire, but a lot of young people were asked, what do you want to be when you become older? And they said, I want to be famous. But famous for what? I don't care. I want to be famous. And so the idea here is that we are so drawn by famous people, and also popularity and exposure, and just everybody wants to have a voice on the internet, right, on their profile and things like that. But what is interesting in Jesus' life is that he does serve. He is doing God's will, and yet he withdraws often into solitude when we read the Gospels. And it's very insane because this is so backwards compared to how I do ministry at times, or the way people do ministry, or the way we even think about how to take these opportunities, right? My natural inclination would be, oh man, I'm gonna take this opportunity to become popular so that God's word is heard everywhere and things like that. And I'm not saying that is, I'm sure that that's the path for some people, and that's God pleasing. The point is not necessarily to discourage people from using these opportunities to share the gospel. That's really good. That is necessary. Okay. The point I'm trying to make with this is that we see this rhythm of Jesus retreats into solitude and then comes back to keep serving. So Jesus is not a hermit, okay? But solitude, it was an integral part of his life. And if we were to put a comparison here on how most ministers do ministry, we would say we typically highlight active ministry, and then second place, community, fellowship, being with people, and then if we have time, solitude. Now, if you are extroverted, and if you have some level of emotional immaturity, and you experience a lot of fear of missing out, or FOMO, like I do, then solitude is just out the window. It's not even part of it, right? So and that happens to me many times in conferences. We talk about God, we teach about God, but I have such a difficult time being with God, you see. And so this is something to take into account, and for me this is especially difficult, withdrawing into solitude, right? But Jesus, if we see the pattern of Jesus, is the reverse from my pattern, and I would say from the life of many. Jesus lived his life in the following order. So first solitude, being with God, then community, and then ministry. Of course, this is not so neat and clean. It's very hard to establish like the ultimate hierarchy based on passage frequency and things like that. But I don't think that is a stretch to say that solitude, it was essential in the life of Jesus. And then, of course, community. He was with the 12 and then the other people that follow him. And then the active ministry, Jesus was all the time serving, right? And so And so the point here is that we need to learn to do ministry, to serve, to build God's church following Jesus's lifestyle. Why? Because if we do it the other way, we're going to deform ourselves. We are going to have an inner life that cannot sustain our spiritual and life responsibilities. Okay, but I just want to clarify something very important. We see in Jesus that he goes back in active ministry, and he is still living this cruciform way of life. Because I think that the temptation for people who are more laid back and chill and hippie and all of that is, oh, great. Yeah, I mean, I see Jesus withdrawing into solitude, then I cannot be asked to serve, or I cannot be asked to sacrifice sometimes my time of rest and things like that. And sometimes we can make solitude of these practices into part of our happiness spirituality or wellness spirituality, I cannot do anything or serve in any way until I feel good with myself. But that's just not the point, because being tired at the end of the day is actually a sign of maturity. Being ready in season and out of season is actually a good thing. And many times we do need to sacrifice a lot of our time and comfort and resources to serve God and to serve the church. Bueno, to serve God, to please God, to be aligned with God, and of course to love our neighbor. So that would be basically an important emphasis here. Now, I need to say something too, because I think that this could be misconstrued. I have the problem of overdoing too much and killing myself for the right thing, and then missing God in the middle of it, the process. That is my tendency. For example, when I hear 1 day you will rest, 6 days you will work, I need to hear 1 day you will rest, 1 day at least. And so, great. But I would say the majority of people, and maybe this includes you need to hear the other part. 6 days you will work. And I think that a lot of people highlight the rest part, the feel good part type of thing, but they are already, I would say that the problem with most people nowadays is not so much that they are killing themselves for the right things, but rather that they are too distracted, too sleepy, that they are not even doing the right thing, being tired for the right reason. Does that make sense? And so here, I just want to be very careful. Because again, if your time in solitude does not translate into you living a more cruciform way of life, if your time in solitude does not translate into you loving more your neighbor, and that includes brothers and sisters, the lost, and everybody, if that is not reflected in how sacrificial and how loving your life is after your time in solitude, then I think that this is not the solitude of Jesus, basically. It's not the solitude of Jesus. Solitude could deform you spiritually and make you a more selfish person rather than more godly and more loving and more peaceful. So I think this is important to say. And this is extremely important to take into account. So depending on who you are and where you are in the spectrum, you need to be careful in not making solitude just part of your wellness spirituality. Oh, one more thing that I add in my agenda of in my program for happiness, or in how I want to chill and live my life. It's very important. Now, for people like me, it's so healthy. It's so life-giving to be in solitude with God. Because again, my tendency is to do a lot of things for God without God. So you need to examine yourself with your trainer, with the people who know you, to really think about where you are at in this, what would you say, like these dynamics, these spiritual biodynamics in our life of solitude, community, and then active ministry. But anyways, hopefully this framework was helpful. And I just want to leave you with a saying from the Desert Fathers and Mothers. from the past. These were people who live in the North African desert, among other places. I think in the 4th century, or 5th, I can't remember right now. And they said the following: "We retreat from the world for the world." I repeat, we retreat from the world for the world. And so you see this tension, right? It's like how the solitude is so connected to the doing, to the active, to what we pour out for people in love and for love. Anyways, so that would be the first class, and hopefully you find it helpful.